Good morning. I'm Sharon Rubin. I'm on the adult education. Hello? Can you hear better?
Yeah.
Okay. Good morning. I'm Sharon Rubin. I'm representing the Adult Education Committee here at Temple Bay Rishon. It is really my pleasure to welcome you to our first distinguished speaker of our I am amazed that we have kept this going with wonderful speakers, very high quality, a wonderful meal, and a lot of enjoyment. And there are some people that I have to thank. First, I'd like to thank the Adult Education Committee. Laura Hertz, the chair, is unfortunately home with her mom who is sick. Allison Cohn, Sharon Glassman, who you see running around, Stan Goodman, Jason Oken, me, Karen Sackstein, who may be signing in from Nashville, I'm not sure, Brenda Chesney, Susan Sorkin, and of course, thanks to our office staff who work tirelessly to get everything organized and to do the programs. But I would especially like to thank our patrons because they, you know who you are, have been supporting our efforts every year. You come back like clockwork, you never falter. And Karen Sackstein is calling me at this very moment. So she's probably saying, what is the Zoom? So I will call her back later. Okay, in any case, there are a couple of special people that I would like to thank among the patrons. The Emmert family has supported this lecture series for many years. And today we have with us Larry Emmert, David Emmert, and our beloved emeritus rabbi, Ken Emmert. So I'd like to give them like a little special applause. You know, they have been into this all the time that Rabbi Emmert was the rabbi here, and they keep coming back year after year. And I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to see our rabbi who now lives all the way in California. So thank you. I'm now going to call Susan Sorkin, who's going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Sharon. As always, a beautiful introduction. I appreciate everybody's we all do appreciate your being here this morning. And it's my privilege to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Rachel Hallote, professor of history at SUNY Purchase, and previously the director of their Jewish Studies program. Dr. Hallote holds a doctorate in Near Eastern Archeology from the University of Chicago and does her excavation in Israel primarily during the summers. We are so fortunate to have Dr. Hallote with us in person today. By the way, she said this was her first in-person presentation in 2 years, I think. Yeah, so we're honored. And she hails from New Rochelle, so she's really a neighbor. And additionally, she is married and has 2 grown children. Dr. Hallote will speak to us about the misuse of archaeology for political gain in Israel. A very hot topic and very timely considering the elections in Israel and our upcoming election. There will certainly be many, many questions for Dr. Hallote. We ask you to hold them until after her presentation, and she will address as many as time allows. Thank you, Dr. Hallote.
I'm so happy to be here, and thank you to everyone who made this morning possible, to Rabbi Waxman, who I'm sorry not to have a chance to meet, who issued the original invitation, and to Laura Hertz, who I also did not have a chance to meet, who has just been fantastic getting this whole event organized, and to Susan Sorkin and Sharon Glassman running the Zoom. Thank you all. I'm very happy to be here. The topic of this talk is politics and archaeology, with particular reference to the archaeology of Israel. And I want to start by saying that I teach an entire course on politics and archaeology. So this is just a taste. This is a sort of dip into a huge iceberg of a topic. So, for instance, have you ever noticed that the timing of archaeological news falls around holidays? Here is one, from just a couple of weeks ago, right on time for Sukkot, about archaeologists uncovering part of a road possibly associated with pilgrimage festivals in Jerusalem. So Sukkot is one of the biblical pilgrimage festivals. No matter that this was actually excavated in 2007, it's still news fodder in 2022. It's eye-catching, and it's a way of making archaeology seem relevant to today by emphasizing the continuity from past to present, which is a form of politicization, as we're about to see. In fact, archaeology is present at every level of politics. On the very local level, whenever you build a new structure, anything from a house to a condo complex to a bridge, you have to do an archaeological survey of the area first. This is the law in most countries, federal law here, delegated to the state level and often to the local level as well. If archaeologists find anything in an archaeological survey, and here you're just looking at one of several methods of surveying, this is just a reconnaissance survey, people walking to see if there's anything on the ground. There are other ways of surveying as well. But if you find anything in the archaeological survey, you have to stop and excavate it properly before any construction can take place. And these laws have prevented the destruction of cultural heritage throughout the world. They've also frustrated contractors and everybody involved in the business of construction. And often it is a very costly issue. If you have to move your entire plan half a mile to the south, you have to get an architect to redo the entire thing and so forth, and engineers. So, the construction business doesn't love archaeologists. Another aspect of archaeology and politics coming together is in wartime. And I could cite multiple horrible examples, but here's one from just a few years ago when ISIS purposefully destroyed archaeological sites in Syria and northern Iraq because they represented both pre-Islamic idolatry and also Western interest in Iraq and Syria. And they also publicly executed a well-known Syrian archaeologist, Khaled Assad, at the archaeological site of Palmyra, where he had spent decades working in the field. Today, Ukraine's monuments and museums are at risk right now. These news stories are from a few weeks ago, but had I searched this morning and had time to add it into my slideshow, there's stuff unfortunately going on every day there. But today I'm going to talk about something larger, which is that worldwide ancient history and archaeology are often taken out of context to make arguments about current political conflicts. This is true on both sides of the Arab-Israeli conflict. I'm going to present you with 3 specific cases this morning. The first does not come from Israel, rather from Egypt, where the modern discipline of archaeology was born, at least the modern discipline of Near Eastern archaeology began in Egypt. So by looking at the dawn of professional archaeology, we're going to see how and why archaeology and politics have been inextricably linked since the very beginning. And then we'll move on to 2 examples from Israel. The first will be Masada, and the second will be Jerusalem. Hang on, I just have to adjust my computer here. Shouldn't affect anything except Okay, sorry about that. Right. So, oops, where to go? To Egypt. Yeah, that's right. To Egypt and to Napoleon. Bet you didn't expect to see Napoleon this morning. He is the one who's correctly credited with beginning the discipline of archaeology in Egypt and in the Near East as a whole. So Napoleon led military campaigns to Egypt early in his career in 1798. His intention was to conquer Egypt as another way to undermine British access to India by disrupting their trade routes. And his excuse was to help the Ottoman Empire regain control of Egypt after a Mamluk uprising. From a military point of view, his expedition was a failure. He had one successful battle in 1798, the Battle of the Pyramids, it's often called. But then the next year in 1799, the French were decisively defeated at Abu Qir, in the Western Nile Delta, and Napoleon kind of turned tail and ran. But believe it or not, military victory was not Napoleon's only goal in Egypt. And while he lost militarily, he won a very different sort of war in Egypt. For educated Westerners, the ancient history of Egypt was well known. Greek historians who described Egypt's culture and ancient history were read in universities, and great temples and monuments were still obviously easily visible on the landscape for adventurous travelers. And Napoleon, who was well educated in ancient history, had long equated himself with Alexander the Great, who had conquered Egypt in 381 BC. Alternately, he thought of himself as a modern day pharaoh. And here are just some quotes. I realize that the screen is small to read these. Think of it, soldiers, from the summit of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you. And another quote, probably said by Napoleon: Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, and I have founded empires. So that's Napoleon for you. Note how, yeah, you can see it in this slide, how most depictions, most paintings of Napoleon show those pyramids in the background. He's pointing to those pyramids. He's making this association on purpose. So knowing this, we can understand Napoleon's non-military goal in coming to Egypt, which was to conquer Egypt culturally, to make himself the ruler of ancient Egypt by cultural dominance of its land and its ruins. When he arrived in Egypt in the spring of 1798, he came with 328 ships, holding an army of 38,000 soldiers, most of whom were military soldiers, but 167 were not. These 167 people were his savants, his scientists, his scholars. They were astronomers, mathematicians, chemists, mineralogists, linguistic experts, technicians, painters, poets, engineers, mechanics, balloonists, doctors, pharmacists, zoologists, botanists, draftsmen, architects, antiquarians, musicians, and political economists. They were all part of France's newly founded Institut d'Egypte, whose mission was to conduct studies and spread knowledge about ancient Egypt. These scholars copied, measured, made plaster casts, collected animal and plant and mineral specimens, collected stone reliefs to bring home, and collected sarcophagi, Egyptian sarcophagi, to bring home to study. And here you can see images of these savants doing various measuring and drawing techniques. I'll show another picture in a minute. In the end, Napoleon's scholars they've produced 31 volumes known as the Description de l'Egypte, published between 1809 and 1828. This was a huge undertaking, and it's what began the academic study of Egypt. You can just see the sheer amount of these folio-size volumes here. So, several recent scholars have looked at the implications of Napoleon's discovery of Egypt. And I have to put discovery in scare quotes because, of course, Egypt didn't need to be discovered. Everybody, both living there and not living there, knew about something about Egypt. There is a wonderful 1995 article by Anna Godleska, a professor of geography at Queen's University, Canada, which examines images in the description. And let's take a quick look at the frontispiece. And again, I'm sorry this projects so small, but if you can't see it, you'll have to trust me about what you're looking at. The top and the bottom of the frame, oopsie, the computer is slipping a little. The top frame and the bottom frame show the conquest of the Mamluks using Roman imagery, Roman iconography. And along these sides here, you have the names and insignia of battles fought in Egypt, Palestine, and Syria, because Napoleon, when he turned tail and ran from Egypt, ended up going north, hoping he could conquer Ottoman-controlled Palestine and Syria. He didn't, but that was his intent. And just in the manner of ancient Egyptians, even the battles he lost, he included in this list of victories. This was something the ancient Egyptians would do. Everything was a victory, even if they lost, and Napoleon kind of did the same thing here. But if we look in the middle, the main scene, which I think you can see pretty well from this slide, it's a composite about everything from ancient Egypt. You can see an obelisk, a nice tall obelisk, sort of front left. And you can see many temples and columns and statuary and plants, and running through the middle is the Nile River. Okay, so everything important about Egypt. But there's things that are not in there. Whoops, I've gone too far. Sorry. There's things that are not in there. There's no people. There's no modern stuff. Okay. What about what is it about Egypt that the Westerners, that Napoleon and other scholars cared about? It was and respected. It was ancient Egypt. It was not the modern people of Egypt and the modern buildings in Egypt. Godleska drives the point home by looking at some of the many plates in the 31 volumes published by Napoleon scholars. And she points out that the drawings of the maps and the land are a way of controlling and rationalizing Egypt for European use, for taxation and agricultural landholding. The maps were done on a scale of 1 to 86,400, which was the established norm for mapping France. Okay, it was a physical linking of Egypt and France politically. Cartography as a way of controlling. The names of all the artists, engineers, and everybody else who made each plate were recorded. Godleska says that this is declaring squatters' rights. The French are declaring their presence, making themselves part of the monuments, or at least the depictions of the monuments of Egypt. The plate we're looking at is of Luxor, part of Thebes. The mounds of archaeological import are sketched with topographic detail, but the area of the modern town is left as a flat blank. That's what the French thought of modern Arabs of Egypt. Or let's look at this one. This is an interesting one. It's black and white. It's a very old plate, so it might be hard to see. But what we're looking at is one of the savants, one of the scholars, dressed in Oriental dress, drawing an ancient statue group. This is the scholar, and these are the ancient statues above him. Lost my place. Yeah, where is it? Yeah, so he is sitting on a level, level of the statue group. He's sitting, the statues themselves are standing, so they're still kind of higher than him, but he is equating himself with them somehow, and yet slightly below, because ancient Egyptian is the pinnacle. Contrast this with the Arab, lazily sitting and smoking on a lower level than the Frenchman and a much lower level than the ancient Egyptians represented by these statues. And then there's this one, it's one of my favorites, where the Frenchman, this time dressed in European style, is drawing this colossus, this colossal statue. And while on first glance, ancient Egypt is much bigger than France, please note that in fact, France has his foot on top of ancient Egypt's foot, symbolizing how France has conquered and tamed ancient Egypt for itself. And the same can be seen on this slide and the next one, where you have two images of Frenchmen climbing on, measuring, and thereby taming the Sphinx, taming ancient Egypt for their own use. Okay, we can see political conquest through archaeology in another way as well. We're still within Egypt. The scholar Donald Reed, Professor Emeritus of Middle Eastern Studies at Georgia State University, wrote a book called Who's Pharaohs? Archaeology, Museums, and Egyptian National Identity from Napoleon to World War I. Reed talks about how, since the time of Napoleon, all scholarship on ancient Egypt was Western, and that Western scholars, especially the French and the British, almost fully excluded the locals from participation. This remained the case until at least the 1952 revolution, and one could argue really until the 1990s. You really didn't have, or you had very, very few local Egyptians involved in scholarship on ancient Egypt. Here are the two charts, the first two tables from Donald Reed's book. And even if you are sitting too far back to see the names, the first column, the very full column, are European scholars, and the second column is the local Egyptian scholars. So you can see between the years of 1747, really, I'm sorry, it's really Napoleon's savants, so this late 1700s until the 1960s, essentially all of the scholars were European. You only have 6 non-European scholars. Here is a table that shows the languages in which guidebooks to ancient Egypt were published in 1830s, decade by decade until World War I. And if you look at the bottom parts, especially the easier travel becomes, the more guidebooks are published, but basically in English and French, some in German, one in Russian, one in Italian, and none in Arabic. So the study of ancient Egypt, the tourism of ancient Egypt, is not meant for the locals. The locals are not included at all. They're sort of semi-actively excluded. This is an image of the facade of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The museum was founded in 1858. The building that you're looking at was built in 1908. And it has plaques. You can see a row of about 6 plaques here. We're going to focus in. Plaques with the names of the European scholars whose work is represented within the artifacts of the museum. All European scholars, I realize it's too small to read. These are all the famous European Egyptologists, Germans and French especially, and some British, no Egyptians. So I think that's my last slide of that group. So the locals were really completely removed from the scholarship about the country that they lived in, pushed out by Europeans. So what were the local Egyptians good for regarding archaeology in the eyes of the Europeans? Well, they were good as dragomans. They were good as interpreters and sort of low-level tour guides, so that fancy European ladies who wanted to see the pyramids wouldn't get dirty. What you're looking at are a bunch of British female tourists being helped to climb the Great Pyramid of Giza by local people, and the local people, as you can tell, are dressed, the local men are dressed very differently. And these European ladies are not really dressed for an adventuresome time. They're wearing these long skirts that must have been very difficult to climb the pyramids in. But the locals were used as dragomans, as helpers, essentially, for the Europeans. And they were also used, of course, as laborers. So that the Westerners could have a workforce to dig the ruins of the greatness of ancient Egypt. But they are not intellectual equals or even counterparts to the Europeans. Europe had used archaeology as a way to degrade the modern peoples and culture of Egypt while appropriating the grandeur of antiquity for itself. So what we've seen so far is that archaeology was born from nationalism and colonialism. And of course, the discipline has grown away from that, but that doesn't mean that national and colonialism has abandoned archaeology as a tool, quite the opposite. With that as our background, let's turn to something more familiar and more recent, how politics, nationalism, and archaeology interact with each other in Israel today. Masada will be our first example and will show how Israel has played hard and fast with archaeological material to promote nationalistic feeling. And our second example, our second example will be from the archaeology of Jerusalem, which will show how Palestinian political leadership willfully misinterprets and misunderstands and even tries to erase archaeological data in an attempt to delegitimize Israel. Let's start with Masada, which is one of the main tourist sites in Israel and has been for decades. I'll bet some people in this room or on Zoom have actually visited Masada. A typical day trip from Jerusalem includes watching the sunrise at Masada, taking a dip in the Dead Sea, and then finishing with another dip in the refreshing waterfalls of Ein Gedi. Masada has become very touristy today, has been really since the 1970s. It's set up with a convenient parking lot, a cable car, so that the climb up to the top of this huge high summit isn't an issue for tourists, and there's very good signage on the top, so you can see everything marked clearly and know what you're looking at. So most of us more or less know the story of Masada, or at least have heard the story of Masada as described by the Roman Jewish historian Josephus. So let's go through that familiar story. Masada had originally been built by Herod the Great, the Roman appointed governor of Judea. About 100, and it was built as a fortress for the Romans, although Herod was a local man, he was very much loyal to the Romans. About 100 years after Herod, when Rome had tightened its hold on the province of Judea, the Jews rebelled against Roman rule. And the Romans fought strongly against these rebels, even sending in their 10th Legion to Jerusalem to put down the rebellion, which they did very effectively. The 10th Legion burned Jerusalem and destroyed the temple in the year 70. But a small group of rebels, known as the Zealots, escaped to Masada, which is south of Jerusalem, and they holed up at Masada for a while. When the Romans finally started to break through their defenses, these rebels, these Zealots, this last group left, chose to commit mass suicide rather than let the Romans kill them. So this story probably sounds familiar to some of you. Masada, with this mass suicide at the end of the story, is not exactly a victory for the ancient Jews, but it wasn't a defeat either. The point was that the Romans never managed to kill them. And as such, Masada has gradually become a symbol of resilience for Jews and for the modern state of Israel. But the story of Masada, as I just summarized, the one that every tourist gets told and every Jewish school child gets told, it's actually a very cleaned up version of Josephus's account. Some scholars have even called it the Masada myth. The actual story of Masada, as told by Josephus, when you read the original text, has a lot more unflattering details that have been expunged over the years. Many scholars have pointed this out, but the most detailed 2 books written by the scholar Nachman ben Yehuda, an Israeli historian, and these books are from the 90s and the early 2000s, but more recent scholars have built on his work as well. So let's go through the ways in which the Masada story has been mythologized. And let's start with the term zealot, which Josephus used. But Josephus also used another term somewhat interchangeably with the term zealot, and that was sicarii, which means dagger men, people who stab with daggers. Sometimes Josephus describes the 960 people at Masada as robbers. Okay, these people who became the holdouts on Masada were the faction of the Jews in Jerusalem who wanted to rebel when not everyone did want to rebel. And the reason most people didn't want to rebel against Rome was because they were rightly afraid of the Roman reaction and Roman retaliation. And I say they were rightly afraid because, again, Rome did send in the 10th Legion, burn the temple, destroy the city, kill a lot of people, and exile the rest. So most people were against this rebellion. But these folks who ended up at Masada were the ones who were leading the rebels on. They were the rebels. So note how only the term zealot is used in the cleaned up retelling of the story of Masada. The rebels of Masada are heroes, not daggermen or robbers. But the truth is that this faction terrorize the majority of Jews who didn't want to go along with the revolt? Well, let's talk about what they did. First, they terrorized the other Jews in Jerusalem who didn't agree with their decision to rebel in the first place. And then they violently killed the entire Roman garrison that had been stationed at Masada in 66. They took their weapons and they marched back to Jerusalem, killing more Romans in Jerusalem. So perhaps we can forgive them this violence because, again, they were killing the enemy. This was war. They were killing Roman soldiers. But then once they came back to Jerusalem, these zealots, these daggermen, refused to help the Jews of Jerusalem against Rome's 10th Legion once it arrived in the year 70. So the rebellion began in 66, but it wasn't until the year 70 that the 10th Legion arrived. The Romans might not have sent the 10th Legion in the first place if the zealots hadn't been so darn violent. And when they needed supplies back at Masada, when the zealots needed supplies, when the rebels needed supplies, how did they get them? Well, they got them by raiding nearby Jewish settlements, like the settlement of Ein Gedi in Passover of the year 68. This was a village of 700 Jews. The rebels stole their crops and their livestock, left them with almost nothing. Other Jews. So the Masada myth, as it's been called, expunged all of this. The term Sicarii disappears, the term robber disappears, the Ein Gedi massacre disappears, their actions in Jerusalem disappear. Who started the expunging? It was this man, a man named Shmaryahu Gutman, an agronomist from a nearby kibbutz, lived close to Masada. And we're talking about the early 1950s. Modern Israel was a brand new state. The extent of the horrors of the Holocaust were just becoming known to the public. Gutman saw the story of Masada as one of heroism, one that redefined Jews not as victims to circumstances and enemies, but as a people who don't give up against all odds, who are in charge of their own destinies. The story of Masada, as I said already, ends ambiguously. A suicide is not a victory, but it's not a defeat either. And it's definitely dramatic. This is what Gutman saw, and eventually what the public saw. Gutman convinced archaeologists, including Michael Aviona, Joseph Abigad, Yochanan Aharoni, and Emanuel Dutnayevsky, to excavate the site of Masada in 1955. And later, Gutman convinced Yigal Yadin to renew the excavations in the 1960s. And the Yadin excavations became very famous. In fact, and this is important, they were known to the public long before the final archaeological reports were published academically. It wasn't just through the tremendous interest that newspapers had as the excavations were going on, but it was also through books that were published while the excavations were going on, books aimed at a popular audience. And one was published by Yadin himself in 1966. Yadin, the excavator, published a book aimed at the public before he published things officially in academic journals. Yadin was already a high-profile person before embarking on his archaeological career. He had been in military affairs and in politics. Specifically, he had served as the chief of staff of the Israeli army. By the time of Yadin's excavations, the Masada myth was deeply entrenched, and the excavations themselves became so famous for themselves that they entrenched the myth even more deeply. So first of all, the excavations were groundbreaking in a couple of ways. They were the first excavations to use volunteers as a labor force, students and others, both Israelis and especially from other countries, especially American volunteers. This started a model that is still used today by Israeli excavations. All over the Middle East, in fact, all over the world, one hires workmen, usually local workmen, to do the hard labor of moving the dirt. But in Israel, it is professionals who are used, students, people on vacation, people wanting to have the adventure of excavation. And in the last 20 years, it has evolved from just being a student-oriented situation where you have to come for a 4-week or a 6-week long period or an 8-week long period. Now you can dig for a day, right? And you can even dig for a couple of hours in various places like Beit Guvrin. So the idea of bringing in everybody, students from diaspora communities in particular, starting young Jews off on a physical connection to the land and to the history of the Jews. This began with Masada. Secondly, the government had to get deeply involved in the Masada excavations. This Masada is in the desert. Let's not forget that. And they're bringing in civilians and foreigners to this desert site that was extremely hard to access during the excavations. This was before there was a cable car. They needed to extend the water pipeline, the Israel water pipeline, 7.5 kilometers to get water to the large number of people working there. So Yadin, who still had many government connections, had the influence to get this done. So talk about a connection to politics and archaeology. It doesn't get more political than this. And the myth making was very much part of his excavations. Among the architectural finds were fortifications, palaces attributed to Herod, and Roman siege camps below the site. And you can see them marked here. According to the archaeologist Jody Magnus, who has worked there and who recently published a book on Masada, these are actually the best preserved Roman siege camps anywhere in the world. Remember the extent of the Roman Empire. These at Masada are the best preserved worldwide. And within the stronghold itself, there were a couple of structures that immediately caught the attention of the public. So here is a top plan, a map of Masada. And one structure was immediately identified as a synagogue, and I put that in fuchsia. That's the one lower on the screen. And one structure was immediately identified as a mikveh, a ritual Jewish bathhouse. That's the one in purple on the screen. And here is the synagogue. You can see it's got some pillars, it's got some seating on the side. If you look at the plan, you can see that there's a sort of a storeroom or a separate room up on the top right. And here is the mikveh, right over here, a plaster-lined tub. The press and the public were very excited about both of these structures, as was the rabbinate of Israel. Some rabbis visited the site in February of 1964 and said of the mikveh that it was amazing that the Jews were worshiping in recognizably Jewish ways 2,000 years ago. Except there were problems with both of these structures. They didn't look right from an archaeological point of view. The synagogue was a little bit older than any other known synagogue in ancient Judea. And when you finally get synagogues, you don't find them in the southern part of the country, you find them only in the northern part of the country, and they don't look quite like this structure looks. So this might be a synagogue, but it might not be. And the mikveh, look at it, you can see that it's pretty small, right? You'd have to really crouch down significantly to immerse, and Jewish ritual immersing requires your entire body to be fully immersed. So it could be a mikveh, or it could just be a vat for water storage. It's a plaster-lined vat of some sort. But more to the point, would Sicarii, would Dagerman have a synagogue and a mikveh? Was religious worship their main concern? Well, maybe. And if not, would Herod have built a synagogue and a mikveh? Herod, who was more Roman than Jewish? Maybe. And should I mention that there were pig bones found in every single archaeological stratum of the site, all over the site? All right, well. Oh, pig bones, pig bones. Pig bones, yes. No, you didn't expect that. Exactly, exactly. Exactly. There were also skeletons found in various places. And for the press reports, the excavator, Yadin, speculated that one group of these skeletons were the remains of the last warriors left alive during the mass suicide. But later on, scholar Joe Zayas analyzed and published the skeletons and the finds associated with the skeletons, the artifacts associated with the skeletons, and that pointed out that among other issues, They were buried with sandals and armor and arrows of Roman types, which means that these bodies probably belonged to Romans, not to Jews. And the mass suicide itself has been called into question by scholars such as Shia Cohn. It seems that mass suicides are a motif in ancient Greek and Roman literature, and they're used by all these authors, Herodotus, Pliny, Plutarch, Appian, Xenophon, and Polybius. And they are used in narratives about all these people who committed mass suicide: Lycians, Sidonians, Cappadocians, Spaniards, Greeks, Gauls, Illyrians, and Phocians. Okay, that doesn't mean the mass suicide didn't happen, but it doesn't give us great confidence in the story either. Back to the burials for a minute. In spite of the fact that they were probably Roman remains, in 1969, these potential Roman burials were reburied as ancient Jewish martyrs in a Jewish religious ceremony, coffins draped with Israeli flags. And Masada, for many years, was a location for swearing in ceremonies for the Israeli army. In other words, in Israel, Masada is the ultimate fusion of politics, nationalism, and archaeology. All right, we're going to change gears. And lest you think at this point that I'm somehow blaming the Israelis for misusing archaeology, let me assure you that every nation on earth does something like this. And with that thought, I want to turn to the most contentious of archaeological places in the world, Jerusalem. So here is the size and location of ancient Jerusalem in comparison to the urban sprawl of Jerusalem today. Jerusalem's ancient and later history is important to several religions for many reasons. Excuse me. David conquers it from the Canaanites in about 1000 BC and uses it as a capital city. Okay, we know this from reading the Bible. Solomon builds a temple there, which stands for not quite 400 years before the Babylonians destroy it. Jews in the Persian period rebuilt the temple in the 6th century, and that one stands for almost 500 years, enjoying this huge refurbishing project done by Herod, the same Herod who built Masada. And it stands until the Romans destroy it in the 1st century, in the year 70, as we already noted. While the Second Temple is still standing, Jerusalem becomes holy to the Christians. Jesus preaches there and dies and is buried in Jerusalem. And the churches and chapels within the Holy Sepulchre Church were later built to commemorate Jesus' burial and resurrection, according to Christian belief. Jerusalem becomes holy to the Muslims in the 7th century. The Quran mentions a place called El Aqsa, which means the farthest, to which Muhammad is mystically transported one night. And a few decades after Muhammad's death, when Islamic armies captured Jerusalem, Islam begins to associate Jerusalem, and specifically the ruined Temple Mount area, with this farthest, with El Aqsa. And they built a mosque over the spot, which is still standing today, and another monument nearby, the Dome of the Rock, both of which are actively part of Muslim heritage and religion today. So like Rome and Athens, Jerusalem is very difficult to excavate because there are modern structures, often religious ones, everywhere, especially over the heart of Iron Age biblical Jerusalem, the areas known as the Temple Mount and City of David. So here is the map I've been showing you, and here is a reconstruction showing you that same little area where the temple would have stood and where David's palace and the administrative area of Jerusalem would have likely have been. Okay. Since archaeology began in the 19th century, archaeologists have been curious about the Temple Mount area. Somewhere in the vicinity of the Muslim Dome of the Rock, built in the 7th century, and possibly right beneath it, lies the remains of the Second Temple itself, and beneath that, the remains of the First Temple. but no one has ever attempted to excavate these remains. So I have another slide. Yeah, I just wanted to show you an aerial view of the whole area known as the Temple Mount. I'll come back to the microphone in a second. You can see the Dome of the Rock. Over here is the Aqsa Mosque, and over here is the Western Wall, okay, place of Jewish worship. This is where the Jewish temple is probably underneath, directly underneath. But no one has ever attempted to excavate these remains. One can't without destroying the Dome of the Rock and other Muslim religious structures on the Temple Mount area. And yet, even without proper excavation under the Temple Mount, there's plenty of evidence for the temple and for the Jerusalem of David, Solomon, and the later kings of Judah. In fact, there's been about 70 plus years worth of work in the area known as the City of David. So there is the temple area and the area right to the south of it, the administrative part of ancient biblical Jerusalem, known as, borrowing a term from the Bible, as the City of David. And much of what has been excavated in this area dates to the Iron Age, the 10th century through the 6th century, essentially. And some of it clearly dates to the height of the biblical kingdom of Judah, which is the 8th century through the 6th century. So we're going to look, we're going to focus in on exactly where the words City of David are written on this map. And we're going to look at a couple of houses, probably houses belonging to the elites of the city in the 8th century. These houses were in use from the 8th century when Jerusalem was at its height, and they continued to be used for 200 years, all the way down to the 6th century, down to the Babylonian destruction of the city. So for instance, this house, which has been nicknamed the House of Achiel, was a house built with 4 rooms with pillars between them, which is actually an Israelite and Judahite style of architecture, well known to archaeologists. And within it was found an ostrakon, a written on piece of ceramic with the name Achiel. So this is why we call it the House of Achiel. Close to this house is another house nicknamed the House of the Bullai. A bulla is a stamp seal, plural is bullai. In its destruction level, archaeologists found many bullai, basically seal impressions. You're not looking at the seal itself, which would have been made in stone. You're looking at, you take your seal and you stamp it into wet clay, and the clay dries, and that's what you're looking at there. So this is the House of the Bullai. These seals would have sealed documents, most likely all sorts of administrative documents having to do with running the royal administration of Jerusalem. One of these includes the name Gemaryahu, son of Shaphan, who was a high-ranking official in the court of King Jehoiakim, mentioned in the Bible. So we actually have from this particular house the name of somebody known from the Bible. These houses were destroyed in the 6th century by the Babylonians, and the room nicknamed the Burnt Room shows clear evidence of the really vicious fire that was part of the destructions. That's why it's called the Burnt Room. And yet, in spite of all this archaeological evidence for Judahite Jerusalem and so much textual evidence about the temple, not everyone is willing to admit that the temple existed. But who could possibly deny the existence of the temple, and why? Well, the main deniers are leaders in the Palestinian Authorities administration, who have stated clearly over the years that there was never a temple to begin with. And of course, if there was never a temple, there was never a Jewish connection to Jerusalem. Removing any historical connection of the Jews to the land of Israel and to Jerusalem is the main goal of temple denial. If there was no ancient Jewish Jerusalem, then the modern Jewish state, Israel, can't use ancient history to bolster any arguments about sovereignty. So let's look at some of the quotes from Palestinian leadership and from the Palestinian media that exemplify this temple denial. So here is Yasser Arafat himself. For years, the Israelis have dug tunnels around the Temple Mount. They have not found a single stone proving that the Temple of Solomon was there, because historically the temple was not in Palestine at all. They found only remnants of a shrine of the Roman Herod. Now they are now trying to put in place a number of stones so they can say we were here. This is nonsense. I challenge them to bring a single stone from the Temple of Solomon. Sheikh Ikrima Sabri, the Palestinian Authority appointed Mufti of Jerusalem. I'm not going to read the entire quote, I'll read most of it. There is not even the smallest indication of the existence of a Jewish temple on this place in the past. In the whole city, there is not even a single stone indicating Jewish history. It is the art of the Jews to deceive the world, but they can't do it to us. There is not a single stone in the Al-Burak wall, the Western Wall, relating to Jewish history. I'm going to skip a little bit. Besides, they've already dug everywhere. All they could find were remnants of buildings from the Umayyad period. Everything they excavated was relating to Arabs and Muslims. Okay. Mahmoud Abbas, okay, still a very important, the most important political figure in the Palestinian Authority, said, the Israelis claim that 2,000 years ago, they had a temple on the Haram al-Sharif. The Muslim name for the Temple Mount means holy sanctuary. I challenge the claim that this is so. Nabil Sa'a, who was the Prime Minister, the Palestinian Authority's Minister of Planning and International Cooperation, said, the Israelis are insisting on sovereignty over the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the pretext that the Israeli, he said instead of Israelite, temple is buried beneath it, and that through their continued sovereignty, they can one day unearth it. Their claim was not substantiated by the excavations they carried out around and under the mosque. However, they insisted on their demand to pray in the courtyard of the mosque. So there are so many mistruths in this statement. You know, nobody has ever dug on the Temple Mount area, and no one prays in the courtyard of the mosque. There might be a few extremists who have tried to do that, but that is not the place of prayer. As you all probably know, is the Western Wall below the Temple Mount, which is the Jewish place of prayer. And here is a very recent quote from the summer of 2021, following an announcement of a first century BC building excavated near the Temple Mount Plaza, near that Temple Mount, near the Western Wall Plaza, that open area, which is more or less a synagogue in terms of its use today, but this was to the west of the main area. A news reporter for the Palestinian Broadcasting Corporation said, these are pictures of the Israeli excavations in Jerusalem in which no archaeological existence of their alleged temple has been proven. This propaganda video is meant to attract tourists and teach them the Israeli narrative, which has no basis other than in their heads that are full of legends and fantasies. The so-called Israel Antiquities Authority revealed that this structure for which they put together a story and invented a narrative that suits their lies meant to Judaize a place that speaks nothing but its Palestinian language. So you can hear the strength of the language here, the negative language, and absolute untruths which are being spread by officials as well as the media on the Palestinian side of things. I should also point out, and I think this is important, that Sari Nusseibeh, who is, I'm trying to get back into my notes to find his, he's a philosophy professor and a well-known Palestinian moderate and longtime president of Al-Quds University in Eastern Jerusalem. He said a few years ago, he did not deny any claims between the Jews and the ancient Jews and the land. He fully understands that there's a claim. And he came under fire. He was essentially canceled for, to use the modern parlance, for saying that, yes, archaeology shows lots of Jewish remains in Jerusalem. And his response was, I'm surprised that that Palestinians are surprised, that fellow Palestinians are surprised by what I wrote. There is nothing in Islam that denies the fact that Judaism is one of the religions of the book. And back in the 20s and 30s, that is before the founding of the modern state of Israel, Muslims never disputed the existence of Jewish temples in Jerusalem and Jewish ties to Jerusalem. So this is a recent political phenomenon. All right, let's look at where this temple denial leads. So here is an artist's drawing of the Temple Mount area. And just to orient you, here is the western, is the western wall. Here is the Dome of the Rock, and here is the Aqsa Mosque. And we are looking at the circled area in the south of the Temple Mount area. I have to find my place. In 1996 through to 2000, the Waqf, the Muslim religious body that has religious jurisdiction in the Temple Mount area, decided to build a new mosque to the southeast of the Umayyad structures on the Temple Mount. And I have the Umayyad structures circled there. And during the course of construction, significant illegal digging was done in order to lower the ground level to connect the location of the new mosque to the other religious structures on the higher ground of the Temple Mount. And here you can see the various places that the digging that I'm about to show you took place. And here's something you need to know about archaeology, which when you think about it, you all know already, but probably people don't really think about it too much. Archaeology is destruction. I tell this to my Archaeology 101 class every single day. Plain and simple, it's destruction. Once you have dug it, it's gone and you can't get it back. This is why archaeologists record everything carefully and in multiple ways and multiple media, drawing and photographing everything properly, taking multiple types of measurements before removing any archaeological matrix. And if you don't do that, you lose everything. And of course, this illicit digging did none of that. Tons of potential archaeological information about the key archaeological area of ancient Jerusalem was destroyed by bulldozers. And based on the quotes from Palestinian leadership that we've just seen, you can understand why. The more that's destroyed, the less chance of anyone proving a connection of the Jews to the site through archaeological remains. So I have a bunch of pictures, probably too many pictures of the illicit digging done by the Palestinian Authority, done by the Waqf in the late 90s and early 2000s. So here you see a bulldozer right on top of the Temple Mount. Here you see a pile of dirt that is archaeological matrix dumped inauspiciously on the Temple Mount. Bulldozer at work going quite deep down, okay? Heavy machinery in front of Solomon's Stables, the area known colloquially as Solomon's Stables. It's Umayyad, it's Middle Ages, it's Muslim buildings. And this is actually interesting because a lot of what they destroyed was actually Muslim material culture. They didn't only destroy the lower levels, which are ancient Judite, but they also destroyed the medieval Muslim stratum as well. Do I have another picture? Is that it? This might be my last one. Here's a trench on the Temple Mount, just dug straight down. Yeah, okay. So the construction crews dumped this archaeological matrix, all the most significant archaeological material ever uncovered in the area. They just dumped it in the Kidron Valley. And here comes the good part of the story. A team of archaeologists were able to conduct a salvage project of the dumped remains. And this salvage project is known as the Temple Mount Sifting Project and is still ongoing, led by archaeologists Gabriel Barkai and Zaki Dvira. This project, which by the way is privately funded and had a shutdown for about a year and then got more funding and started back up again, it consists of hundreds of volunteers sifting through, and they're the two leaders, Gabi Barkai and Zaki Dvira, hundreds of volunteers sifting through the hundreds of cubic tons of debris from the illegal construction project. A significant amount of ceramics from the Iron 2A, the 10th century, the period associated with the narratives of David and Solomon, has been found in this debris, as well as clay bullae and other small objects from the 9th and 8th centuries BC. So just a few slides of the sifting project. You can see archaeologists standing around with volunteers. You can see everything is being sifted and then sorted carefully, good archaeological methodology. Even though the salvaged artifacts were completely separated from their archaeological contexts and all stratigraphic connections were lost, they are archaeological confirmation that there was a major site from the Iron 2A period right where we would expect that the temple was located. Volunteers sorting through a sifter. You can see the scale of this project, all the buckets to the side, all the people working. I have too many sifting images in here, my apologies. And how the archaeologists teach the volunteers who are just there for a couple of hours, how to sort metal from mosaics, from ceramics, from glass, from bones, from special stones that might be artifacts, so that the archaeologists can go through it all later and analyze it and see what they've actually got. Here is a gold bead found by a 9-year-old boy in the summer in November of 2020, 2 years ago now. So there's a lot of riches. It was clearly, well, it was the temple area. It was the temple and administrative area of the religious and administrative area of ancient Jerusalem. Shouldn't surprise us too much that there's great wealth buried under there. Oh, I see that this is too small, but the percentages you're seeing include artifacts from, this is actually from a 2006 preliminary report. I have to update this with more recent preliminary reports, but essentially the statistics have not changed significantly. 19% of artifacts date to the Iron Age, 23% of artifacts date to the Persian, Greek, and early Roman periods when there was a Jewish temple standing there. And 1% dates to the late Roman period, 1st century forward, after which the area was abandoned for a while, or rather during which until the 7th century, the area was more or less abandoned. And then other percentages, of course, later on, 17% Byzantine period, 21% early Islamic, etc., all the way down to 8% from the Ottoman period. But if you add up 23% plus 19% plus 1%, that's a full 42% of materials recovered through sifting dates to the periods when there was either the first or the second Jewish temple standing in the area. Times clearly associated with Judahites and Jews as the main populations of Jerusalem. So in spite of the rather willful, illicit digging on this site and the loss of so much archaeological material in all the archaeological context, archaeology has once again shown that there was a significant use of this space in the periods when the first temple and the second temple stood. And even without proper context, we can see that this was a wealthy area. I showed you that golden bead, as you would expect for a temple precinct. All right, what is the takeaway from all this? What can we conclude? Rather than draw conclusions along the lines of who's bad and who's good in these instances, or make a blanket statement saying that no one should use archaeology for political gain, let's take a more lenient stance. The first takeaway is that using archaeology to further political agendas is just what's always been done and probably always will be done. And as long as nothing is destroyed, that's not the end of the world. For instance, in spite of the story of Masada having become part of a nationalistic agenda, it was carefully excavated, and archaeologists can look at its final reports, as well as look at the actual material that's in storage, so that it can be analyzed and reanalyzed with no agenda in mind at all, even if the original excavator, Yadin, had an agenda himself. And here's the second takeaway. When you hear news stories about archaeology, you shouldn't trust them. Yeah, don't trust journalists about archaeologists. Be careful about when, that is what time of year, what holiday might be coming up, and where you read your archaeological news stories. Note who is giving an interpretation of the archaeological finds and why they may be interpreting it the way that they are. And if it's not an archaeologist talking, and even sometimes when it is an archaeologist talking, take it with not just a grain of salt, but with a whole salt shaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hallote. And now we will take questions.
First of all, thank you for the lecture. It was really enlightening.
Thank you.
Question. When some of the Arab states started doing illegal or improper digging, was there an outcry from archaeologists all over the world?
So, right. So there was outcry from Israeli archaeologists, from the Israeli government, and from archaeologists all over the world, those who heard about it. There was not a public outcry all over the world, though. It didn't really reach the public. Well, I mean, it did. You know, you could pick up the back page of the science section of the New York Times probably and find a mention of it, but it didn't reach proportions where people were really objecting to it.
I have another question. With regard to the slide on Masada, everything seems to have ended in the late 60s. Has there been further 80s, 70s, 80s, and so forth, try to either confirm or disaffirm some of the myths or the history or everything that you spoke about? Right.
So, so the main excavations took place during the 60s and the 70s. Right. And Masada has had a very long publication phase. One of the problems with archaeology in general, and not just in Israel, is it's way more fun to do the excavating in the dirt than to publish your materials. So, and it's also very expensive to publish your materials. It's also expensive to dig, but it takes a long time to get it published. So the final reports of Masada were only published in the early 2000s. In the interim, there have been not full-scale excavations, but kind of, we don't understand this stratum very well. Let's go back and figure out this very small-scale problem. So there have been excavations like that going on, but no large-scale ones since the 70s.
Where would the Egyptian scholars that were assuming when Napoleon was marching through and everything was portrayed as Egyptian disturbance? I mean, there had to have been scholar profession. Where were they?
No, and that's the slides I showed you from Donald Reed's book. Right. Donald Reed tried really hard, really valiantly to resurrect the careers of the few Egyptian scholars that were there. He managed to resurrect the careers of 3 between the time of Napoleon and, let's say, the mid-20th century or so. He found 3 Egyptian scholars who were A, interested enough to want to be scholars, and B, kind of given a place by the Europeans. And the one he found the most information about, turns out he was basically, I don't want to demote his importance, but he was somebody who translated a lot of the French work done by French scholars into Arabic so that the few people in Egypt who were interested could read him. So he wasn't even allowed to do his own scholarship. So, yeah.
I wonder if I'm mistaken to in what how I'm hearing what you said. There are 2 kinds of distortion. One is taking facts and taking the facts that fit your story best.
Right.
The other is to ignore facts entirely. There is no evidence of any Jewish historical. I mean, so then it doesn't matter what they find because there's no interest in truth. So I'm seeing a dichotomy. Am I making something up that doesn't exist?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think what most archaeologists interested in using archaeology for political purposes do the first thing, what is done at Masada, kind of cherry picking your facts. And, you know, yeah, this might have been a synagogue, but no archaeologist worth his salt will say at this point it was definitely a synagogue. So, you know, choosing facts that suit your purpose as opposed to what the Palestinian Authority is doing. And I also should say that there are, for the last 20 years, 15 years, archaeology departments in Palestinian universities, and more and more there are Palestinians who are well trained, who are not the political figures making these statements. So I'm waiting for the sort of local Palestinian backlash against what the political leaders are doing, which is complete denial, as you say. I'm waiting for those newly trained Palestinian archaeologists to find their voice and say to the Palestinian leadership, no, you can't say this, but it hasn't happened yet. Yeah, yeah.
Ron and then Sharon.
I have a question, probably talk about the Palestinians and Israelis, but how about the internal shift relative to the Masada? There's this big thing about finding the lots. Supposedly there are these, they have found the lots, but I've heard there's an archaeological dispute as to whether those are really the lots that did the suicide.
Right, right. So I didn't show a picture of the lots. It's one of the slides I pulled out because I'd be going on for 2 hours. So when you read Josephus's story, you hear about lots being drawn, you know, who's going to kill whom and in what order. And there have been ostraca found. Ostraca are pieces of pottery that are broken on which you write. You kind of use them like scrap paper, we could say. So there have been lots found, and at least one of these ostraca does have a name of one of the people mentioned in the Josephus narrative. What we don't know, so it could be confirming the story, absolutely, but it seems much more likely that these were something to do with rations. Okay, which group of people, which unit gets to have which rations, just based on, and I'm trying to remember the specific find spot within Masada, and I'm afraid I can't remember, but based on the archaeological context, that seems more likely. And also, you know, if there was a mass suicide, wouldn't you expect there to be bodies everywhere? and there weren't. So there are some issues with this, but yes, there have been ostraca found with names of individuals.
Follow, you never says mass suicide, but I understand for Josephus, there were at least a few people who did not commit suicide.
Right. So there are, I think, 3 people, 2 women, maybe a child. I'm not quite remembering it right. Who how did Josephus know any of this? He had to find a device to make it seem plausible that he would know about this. So he talks about 3 people escaping from Masada and hiding in a cave on the side of the cliff. So we do have that story, right?
When this information gets into the media, is there any pattern of rebuttal? You know, in other words, how does the other side follow up, or
Right.
so we can be educated?
Right. So whenever I give this talk, I find it. So the thing is, the Palestinian media and the Palestinian Authority is very savvy, and most of this is published in Arabic publications. And there are various watch groups, which are, you know, a lot of people don't necessarily, even with the within the Jewish community, they think of these watch groups as sort of far to the right, like Jihad Watch, for instance. But what these watch groups do is they scour the Palestinian media that is only published in Arabic, and they translate it so that people like me who are looking to put together slideshows like this can find the quotes. In other words, this is the narrative that they basically say to their own people. You would not find Arafat or Mahmoud Abbas saying this to an English language audience ever. You only find it in material that is disseminated to a Palestinian or an Arabic speaking audience.
So lucky for us that we've had the opportunity to hear what you know. How do you and others then disseminate the information?
I believe fully in bringing archaeology to the public. In fact, I have a podcast which does this, and one thing, and it's kind of what I and what other I'll take off the self-promotion. What I and others do try to do is through lectures like this is to bring this material and the problems in this material to the public. It's why I teach, and I teach only undergraduates. My institution is only undergraduates. It's why I teach a course called Politics in Archaeology. And while I do Masada in this course, I go around the world and talk about political issues, because I think this is the one that's nearest, dearest to the hearts of the people in this room and on Zoom. But, you know, the Greeks are really, really upset that the British and the French have all of their artifacts. And there's a lot of issues like that. So the more public dissemination, you know, tell your friends that this is an issue.
We know Josephus is an Arabic, is accurate.
No, yeah, so we basically, archaeologists and scholars of Josephus do not trust Josephus equally on everything. So like I mentioned, he probably borrowed the motif of mass suicide from all these other classical authors who also used the motif of mass suicide. And again, I don't want to say that it definitely didn't happen, but we can't really confirm that it did. And again, the convenience of saying, oh, well, these couple of people escaped and I happened to run into them and I know the story and I'm telling it. Josephus was really writing, and here's another sort of ironic thing. He was writing his book, The Jewish War, of which the Masada sequence is a piece of. He's writing this for a largely Roman audience. Josephus was a general in the rebel army, the Jewish rebel army in the north, and his unit was captured really early on. And then he tells a story about himself, which is also eerily similar to a story told about one of the rabbis of the Sanhedrin at the Roman destruction, about predicting that the Roman general Vespasian, who was at that point a general, was going to be the next emperor. And Vespasian remembered his prediction. When he became emperor, he saved Josephus and brought him to Rome as a member of the court. So a lot of the emperor's family, essentially, Josephus Flavius, the Flavian dynasty of Rome. So a lot of what Josephus writes is politically motivated to have favor with the Romans who didn't kill him. So we take a lot of grains of salt with him.
A couple things. Weren't there synagogues contemporary to the time of the slaughter, where it stood, for example, pre-temple destruction?
Right, in the Galilee, that's pretty much, yeah, so
it's not implausible that could have been synagogue.
it's not implausible, exactly. Most of the synagogues are a couple of decades later than Masada. And you can say a couple of decades isn't that much, but you can also argue that actually it is significant. So in other words, this could be an early outlier synagogue far away from where people really started to build synagogues, but it's not very compelling. And I'm not saying that it isn't. And I really think the more we dig, the more buildings that are unrecognized as synagogues will be interpreted as synagogues. So the more archaeologists dig, we may in fact find more definitive proof that this is a synagogue. No, maybe later than this. I'd have to check, honestly. Yeah,
It's about pig balls. Wasn't there a monastery after the Romans?
there was.
It's a monastery.
Right. However, the monastery is not on the main mound. It's kind of on the side there. And archaeological stratigraphy, you can have very carefully delineated stratigraphic levels. So you're not going to be fooled into thinking, you know, these are bones from the 1st century when they're really bones from the 7th or 12th century. That's because archaeology is actually a fairly precise science. So, yeah.
Thank you.
We're back in Egypt for a second. How was the Rosetta Stone?
Rosetta Stone was found by Napoleon's troops. They were actually digging a fortification trench at Rosetta, which is right near Abu Qir, where that second big battle that Napoleon lost was located. It had been an Ottoman fort, but they were refashioning it as a French fort. And one of the diggers, one of the foot soldiers, found this stone, and his name is lost to history. But his supervisor's troop leader's name, I can't remember it off the top of my head, but we know his name. And because there were these savants, all these scholars all around, the Greek part of the Rosetta Stone was translated immediately. So the Rosetta Stone was actually in secondary use. So the Rosetta Stone dates to the 1st century, I want to say. I can't do it without my teaching notes in front of me. Dates to the time of Ptolemy the 5th, I think it is, and it's a inscription that basically glorifies the pharaoh. And it was at some point removed from its original location, which was somewhere in the area. Sometime during the Ottoman period, it was removed. It was used simply as a building block, something that is very commonly done with archaeological remains in later periods. You'll take perfectly good stones and reuse them in secondary use. And it was used in this Ottoman fort. And then when the French were redigging, they came across it.
Rabbi.
The question that I have is with archaeology today. When they're trying to discover the Noah's Ark, for example, you hear stories like that about evangelicals.
Right.
And of course, like those again who are rightly understanding the Bible.
Right.
If you pull one brick out, you destroy their whole thing. So there is something about them. They want, obviously, to look for these archaeological digs and to prove the Bible.
Right.
So you have to be very careful as far as leaving these archaeological kind of, well, where it comes from.
Right.
The idea, because they're looking to bolster the saying, well, we found this point, and this proves that this happened in the Bible.
Exactly.
That's
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And even within scholarship, there's been, it's dying down now, a controversy for 20 or 30 years, minimalists versus maximalists within archaeological scholarship. And maximalists, you know, will look at remains from the 10th century and say, Solomon, Solomon, Solomon. And minimalists are really problematic because they will say, well, you know, the Bible was written much later and a lot of it was made up much later. And, you know, even though we're finding these big monumental buildings, that doesn't mean there was a kingdom of David and Solomon. So it's really a problem within academia as well as, or certain parts of academia, as well as in the faith-based communities.
Thank you, Sharon. Do we have any questions?
One I think was answered here.
Oh, okay, great.
We'll take one more question. I think. Oh, yeah.
The pictures you've shown of digs are techniques that we've seen for years, sifting, the digging, everything else. As technology and science is advancing in leaps and bounds.
Right.
Are there other techniques that help? Whether it's sonar, laser, vibration?
Right, absolutely. So ground penetrating radar is a great example of this, where you basically run a device that looks like lawnmower over your area. And it's a radar machine, and it picks up things in layers underneath. The problem with that technique, and I'm picking on that technique for a reason, but the problem with a lot of techniques is you need to do what's called ground truthing. You see things underneath the surface and, oh, isn't this great? You don't even need to dig to see what's under there, but you don't know what it is you're looking at. You don't know if you're looking at a wall, if you're looking at an ancient trench, you don't know the details. So you still have to dig. Yeah.
So
Right, exactly. You can certainly see, and this is one way that it's used on surveys, you can see if there is nothing there or if there is something there, and that might give you a hint of what to dig. There are tons of uses of technology. Some are really basic and useful. Instead of an old-fashioned theodolite to measure height, to measure elevation, you can now use laser theodolites, total stations, which do that much faster. So there are definitely uses of archaeology. I could go on, but I won't.
You could go on. We cannot hear that at our level, but perhaps you'll stay for a few minutes. Sure. Thank you so much.
Laura Hertz asked me to be sure to make an announcement that our next distinguished speaker is Dr. Ruth Calderon on March 5th. And many of you have asked about Rabbi Waxman. He is feeling under the weather, so he is not here today, but we wish him the best. So thank you for coming.
And I just wanted to add, thank yous are always in order because we could not be doing this. And there are two aspects of this program that, you know, cannot be denied. First of all, the meal part. And I just want to thank David and Brenda for the kugels and all the food there. And the other thing is the level of technology that's here. I mean, you need to be impressed that this is what we can do at our synagogue. And it's thanks to David Edelson, who every time he reinvents some tool or something to do, and as you can see, we're constantly improving it. So cannot thank David and our IT committee as well. So time, Laura?
You just have to put up against. Sure.
Okay, great. Okay, and so dessert and coffee are still available. And just a quick question. This is kind of a hybrid setting, you know, because of COVID. Does this work, or should we go back to putting the tables around? You know, we just want everybody to feel comfortable. If you've got any strong feelings about, you know, setting it up either way, just please let us know, because we want everybody, even those people on Zoom, to feel that it's comfortable to come here. You can come, you can mask, you can separate, you can eat outside, and so on. Anyway, looking forward to a great year.
All right, thank you, all the Zoomers. Have a good day.
They are, yeah, they're just,
And are they cooperating with the Israeli authorities?
they are, yes, more or less.
And you think at a scientific level, they want to get to the truth?
That one, what?